Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And yes, I did want to tee this up. It probably looks weightier than it actually is, and I will start by saying that we have educational sites as item A, just to begin a conversation, as some of you know, on the work plans that we have put forward to all of you over the next months to come. There's a number of very important issues that we're going to have to take up beginning immediately and going right on through the summer and the fall. Amongst those items are ultimately going to be, how do we decide what the next university is going to be and what's the process for that? How do we look at educational sites and centers and branch campuses to make certain that there is a reasonable and organized approach to all of these issues? And so Richard is going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But I wanted to tee it up by assuring you that because that conversation is taking place, there is no reflection on items B and C in that regard. Those are regular and freestanding issues of classification of center in one case and acquisition of property in the other. But they are separate items, even though obviously they fall under the domain of just what we're talking about. I just wanted people to understand that the two are not connected. The conversation we're about to engage in, and we will keep it brief, I promise you, is meant to largely tee up the whole issue of the work plan and how at the end of the day we're going to work with you all in the universities to better organize our process of how an institution becomes one, how a center becomes one, a site becomes one, a branch campus, and so on, and how we acquire property for potential expansion going forward. So having said that, Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me, I'll turn this over then to Richard, and he can begin the conversation on educational sites.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to make this as brief as I possibly can, so if I go too fast, certainly slow me down and make me back up. Many people who were on the board back in 2006 will remember that we had a very similar presentation on branch campus approval, and at that time it was pointed out that due to the transition between governance systems that there was a disconnect between the acquisition of property and the approval of a branch campus. I'm happy to say that since that time that disconnect has been largely done away with, and what we now have, if the same will click, thank you, is a board regulation in place for powers and duties of the University Board of Trustees, and it's Regulation 1.011, that essentially says that the Board of Governors has to approve any binding contractual obligation to improve real property with state funds. This puts the board in the position of reviewing any property that's going to be acquired that has some kind of binding, as had been hammered into me by Vicki, contractual obligation that requires actually investment of funds for construction or ongoing maintenance and things like that. At the same time, this same regulation gives university boards of trustees quite a bit of authority and latitude to acquire and sell real property. So this really addressed, in large part, the disconnect that we saw that was in place in 2006. When it comes down to the actual approval of branch campuses or centers, we have two regulations in play. Once again, the Regulation 1.011, where it requires that the University Board of Trustees submit plans for all new campuses and centers to the Board of Governors for approval. We also have in place Board of Governors Regulation 8.009, which is a very dated regulation, and we have not had an opportunity to update that regulation in the past year or so, because we've also been engaged in conversations about system structure. But basically what this regulation provides is the typology of off-campus education sites, and it's somewhat out of sync with the regulations that you see above it, and that it actually provides conditions for the Board of Governors approval by level. And it's also misaligned in the fact that it doesn't address any action by the University Board of Trustees. But what we have in this regulation, and you actually have, I think, on page 23, a table that outlines these different types of branch campuses. But basically, we have an existing regulation now, a typology, that is what you see on this board: type 1, 2, and 3 branch campuses based on their level of FTE. A center, basically often referred to as an instructional center, which usually has less than 300 FTE. And then special purpose centers, and that is typically either related to some form of service or primarily research. And then you get into the instructional sites and the special purpose sites, which are typically leased properties where some instruction takes place or some research takes place. And these, as long as they're leased, do not require the approval by the Board of Governors. And with regard to the centers, as long as there's no state funds associated with construction, they are currently not required to come before the board for approval according to this regulation. And that's another one of the little gaps and disconnects that we hope to fix in the future. But what we've seen as we've engaged in conversation with the universities, and also been conducting research on other states and taking a look at what they are doing, that we see some emerging and in some cases existing sites that just simply don't fit into that typology. And this gives you an idea of some of the things that we've seen happening in Florida and elsewhere. We've seen the creation of separately accredited campuses in the past few years. We're also seeing what could be referred to as multi-institutional campuses, and I think that what you have there is as an example, might be what's starting to occur around the Lake Nona area and in the health care city, so to speak, that's developing there, where you have institutions that are moving in to be close to Burnham, or moving in to be close to that nexus of health care and health research. And then, as has been brought up by a number of individuals on the universities, at the university level, we have this thing that has occurred with adjacent or nearby campuses that are really under the administration of the main campus, and yet they are removed somewhat from the traditional main campus, and we don't know what really to call them or how to deal with them, because the original typology was primarily aimed at campuses or off-site centers that were more remote and regional in nature. So that just gives you an example of the type of things that we want to be able to deal with as we continue with this discussion. So looking forward, what we have now is really an opportunity to review the system structure and, really talk about reasonable and responsible geographic access to education and geographic access, and in some cases even to research and to service. And then the other thing we hope to accomplish is to really have a clear pathway for the planning and approval of off-campus sites. That right now, as I had pointed out, there were some gaps and disconnects still in the existing regulations. And what has been suggested to us strongly by some of our university folk is that we really need clear criteria and guidelines for developing a proposal for new sites, and for being able to make sure that we're covering all the concerns that this board might have. One thing that is missing right now from the existing regulations is any process for closing or relocation of a site. And another thing is that we certainly would want the opportunity to be able to update the typology, because the typology is kind of used to not only describe the system for system level planning, but it's also a way to demonstrate to constituents your level of commitment to their area and to describe the level of access that might be occurring in the particular areas. And with that, I think I can answer mine.
What's the takeaway from all of this? Relatively obvious. We're still using a system that's been around for quite some time. Much of that system still serves us well, I think, after having reviewed it with everyone. But clearly, as the system evolves into the future, we're going to need to come forward with some additional changes and amendments to the current system to make sure it serves the needs of the state university system in the out years.
So that is something we've begun to take up. Again, as Richard mentioned, we're going to work very closely with the universities in trying to accomplish that. And we never want anyone to lose opportunity, to lose access to an opportunity because our system doesn't allow for it. And we don't want to get in people's way if that opportunity is not only good for the university but good for the system. It's just a matter of making sure that we have a system overlay that will help to guarantee those things, and that will truly support what universities are trying to do, whether they're adding a center, a site, proposing a branch campus, or acquiring new real property. It is not only an institutional decision, but it's a part of a systemic approach to our state university system going forward. So with that, again, and separating that overview from these two following requests, I just wanted to be clear on that these two only teed up the need to have that conversation based on the work plan that is in front of all of you for the next 6 to 7 months to come.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions?
When we went through this on the briefing, I didn't understand the distinction, but I think I do now. The branch campus type 1, 2, or 3 center special purpose, that's essentially for the universities to worry about the designation. As far as this board is concerned, if state funds are being used as set forth for establishment or expenditure state funds or facilities, we're approving it, period, right? I mean, it comes to the Board of Governors from a special purpose center on up. Everything else is for each of the universities in their own classifications. Not much of an issue for us.
Not really, Governor Tiga. I'm sorry, Governor.
Works for me.
Governor. Right now there is a little disconnect that is in the branch campus or educational sites regulation that can be fixed very easily with the Board of Trustees regulation. Supersedes that because it was actually promulgated later than the board adopted the 8.009. So right now, centers up, if I understand and interpret it correctly, would come forward.
Centers would too.
Yep.
Yeah, from special purpose center on up is
Correct.
what I'm looking at here.
Yeah.
Right, but as far as we're concerned, they're coming here notwithstanding from special centers on up. So this designation, 2,000 or 1,000 or 2,000 is essentially for the universities to use in employing their resources and figuring out what they're, but as far as our actions, they're all the same from special center on up.
Yes, sir, that's correct. And my understanding, and we did a little research on this going back and talking to people who were around at the time that this particular regulation was put together, and it was the intent really was always to kind of be able to categorize the different types of branch campuses and off-site educational sites for the purpose of planning.
Okay. We now move on to item 4B, consideration for a proposal to classify University of Florida Research and Academic Center Lake Nona as a center. Chris Kinsler? Chris?
Thank you very much, Governor Martin. Very much love an example of the question Governor Perez just raised. The University of Florida is coming forward to the Board of Governors asking for designation of its Lake Nona proposed site as a SUS, as a center. And the last time the board took action similar to this was about 2 years ago for UCF at Lake Nona. So we have done this very infrequently, but yet that is the existing regulation. Staff have vetted this. It appears to be appropriate, fall within the guidelines of the regulation to be a center. I would point out to the committee also that it received an appropriation of $6 million previously from PICO, and this morning in the Facilities and Budget Committee, an additional $3 million of PICO was approved for this center. With us today to present for the university is Dr. Wynn Phillips. He's the Vice President for Research at UF. He's been the Vice President for Research and Dean of the Graduate School since '99. Prior to that, he was Dean of the College of Engineering. And just very briefly, the Office of Research is comprised of the Division of Sponsored Research, the UF Graduate School, and the UF Research Foundation. And it's a very impressive entity. It manages $500 million annually in public and private grants, serves more than 10,000 graduate students, and has royalty and license and income in excess of $40 million annually. And so with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Phillips, and then I'm sure he'd be glad to take any questions from the board. Dr. Phillips?
Thank you very much.
But I don't want to hear Dr. Phillips.
By saying aye. Those opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Phillips.
Bernie, you need more like him. Now he gets the job done.
Oh, my. Well, thank you very much. I do want to say you put a lot into it. That's where it's going to be. It's located next to Burnham, which is located next to UCF's properties. So, again, this is a really remarkable achievement. May I take the next item, Governor Martin?
Yes, go ahead.
Then again, I do not need, of course, to introduce President Bradshaw. In keeping with what Richard said earlier, staff have looked at this proposed Buckingham property acquisition. We do not believe that it requires Board of Governors approval. It's subject to 8.009. Yet we've had a few members say, we'd like to know more about this. President Bradshaw will be very glad to talk about their proposed plans for the site. It's a great opportunity for the university. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Bradshaw.
For a short presentation, Dr. Bradshaw.
Thank you, Chair Martin. We'll get through this very quickly. First, I'd like to take this opportunity to personally invite the new governors to visit Florida Gulf Coast University. It's your newest regional comprehensive university, and we'll be very pleased to host you and give you an opportunity to get to know us better. The second thing I'd like to do is introduce a colleague of mine, Dr. Valerie Fields. Dr. Valerie Fields is a participant of the Askew Millennium Leadership Institute, and she is my protege for this year, and she has been spending this week with me at FGCU and here, so I can disavow her of the notion of ever aspiring to be a president. So I just want, Valerie is here from South Carolina State University, where she served as Associate VP for Student Affairs, Interim Vice President, and Professor of Education.
Okay, welcome.
Next slide, please. What you have before you is a summary of the chronology that got us here today, and it's a result of a significant piece of state property being vacated by another state agency, and as is the usual case, so the state offers that up for other entities, universities and municipalities before taking other steps to sell that property. We expressed an interest in the property, and our Board of Trustees authorized me to proceed with taking what steps were necessary to transfer that property to the inventory of FGCU. I have with me Dr. Joe Shepard. Many of you know Joe. Joe is our Vice President for Finance and Administrative Services, and Joe is going to outline some of the features of this property and why it is quite a acquisition for Florida Gulf Coast University. Thank you. Joe?
Thank you, President Bradshaw. Something to keep in mind as we go through the various slides here is that for those of you who will recall, this year FGCU's freshman class will be approximately the same size as 13 years ago when we opened our doors. We're growing rather rapidly. This piece of property is approximately 30 miles from FGCU. It's straight to the north of us in an area called Buckingham, which is a rural designated community. It has a 2-lane access road, and I bring these points up because of the fear, and rightfully so, of people wondering if that would ever be created into a branch campus. A, very close. B, as you'll see, the site doesn't lend itself well to such. The site is approximately, this is an overview of the site. You'll see up at the upper, my little arrow won't work that far, so up in the upper right-hand corner, that's the entrance to the site flowing down in. It already has roads in it, already has the land's cleared with the exception of a couple hundred acres, has about 60 buildings in it, and I'll go more into detail on those buildings in just a second. It does have about 200 acres for future mitigation or environmental sensitivity or preservation. Quick facts about the property. Land was previously used by the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. It's been around and in the state trust fund for about since 1950. It has 500 acres, 300 already developed, 200 acres are adjacent to the Lee County, our county's 2020 lands for preservations. It has about 60 structures, and it can accommodate on the site up to about 300 people staying overnight in overnight accommodations. The site structures themselves, there's 60 structures, and for some of you, to give you an idea of what that looks like, though they were not built as barracks and so forth, they are that type of a low-impact structure that's on the site. It has gymnasium, kitchens, recreation, picnic areas, and small dormitories as well as a swimming pool. All the structures are up to code, and as would be expected given the agency that was running it, and the facilities are in excellent shape. Our staff has done a thorough review of that. The planned site usages. One, of course, is Student Life Retreat Center. We currently off-site that at an expense, and so that would be moved over there to this particular site. Multiple partnerships with the county and other government entities. They've expressed interest in that. Also, emergency planning and operations. This site, every building has a backup generator, and it's an inland site, making it very valuable in that particular strategy. Student and county recreational opportunities, running area, our cross-country team and our county and others can use it for running and so forth. Has a small little baseball field picnic area that also can be used. Research opportunities, expanding our photovoltaics and our other sorts of research could be done at this site as well to provide an additional resource to the university. Continuous education and, of course, limited academic opportunities. Once again, it is not designed for credit classes per se. The associated costs, and this is a subject that's near and dear to us in many ways. One, the land is free. Remember, this is a transfer. What we're doing is we're taking from the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, one state agency, and moving it to another. The initial estimated value of the land and so forth is approximately $8 million. That's an estimate. We're getting that appraised at as we speak. We estimate that it'll cost about $1.8 million per year for the safety, security, and energy usage and maintenance and upkeep. The strategy is to secure the plant maintenance and operating dollars in the 2011 legislative session. Let me talk about that for just a moment because that is a question to be addressed. Presently, the property does have PM&O, plant maintenance and operating dollars, associated with it, but those go to that agency for disabled persons. We would like to have that transferred over to Florida Gulf Coast University. And we missed this particular session. Additionally, we'll seek revenue-generating activities, sublease to the county. They've already expressed interest in that. Offset some of the current costs with our off-campus leadership retreats. And we'll also take a look at it for various research grant overhead revenues and so forth. So that at the end, we do have a plan in place in terms of how we're going to deal with it, in terms of the state monies and so forth. At this point in time, the President will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you
for the opportunity.
Okay, moving on to item now number 5, 2010 University Work Plans. Chancellor, you want to have a thing to...
Just while Dottie is taking her place at the podium, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As all of you know, and again, I am also mindful of, we just finished orientation for our new members. Under the aegis of accountability, we have developed essentially a three-pronged approach. One is the creation of our dashboard indicators of annual progress for our universities and our system. Second is the much deeper creation of the annual report and the data that goes along with that, and that is a significantly more specific set of metrics and data points that people can use for their own strategic planning, that of the board, legislative purposes, etc. But a very important third prong is the creation of the individual university work plans. That is working with the universities to better identify the personalities of each of our institutions, the major strengths of our institutions, so that ultimately we can better knit the activities of our universities together as a system and make certain that indeed we are efficient and well organized in that regard. Dottie Manier, of course, has been quarterbacking this one for us, but again, I can't say enough about, and I've said it before, about the good people at our universities who have been putting in a tremendous amount of time and energy, all very positively, on the dashboard indicator creation, the annual reporting process that we're engaged in, and now beginning the work planning process. So to that end, I'd like to give Dottie a few moments and thank her in advance for the work that she and other staff members and the people at the universities have done on this entire issue. By the way, editorially speaking, these issues get a great response in the Florida legislature, whether that matters to people or not. This is something that people feel strongly about, that we're headed in the right direction by way of even better organizing our state university system. So with that, Dottie and Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me apologize in advance for my Lauren Bacall voice today. I'm dealing with a little bronchitis here. My main purpose is to just take a few minutes to make sure that everyone is on the same page as far as what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks and months leading up to the June board meeting, at which time the university work plans will be presented in workshop format to members of the board. At least to, we'll work through the details of that, perhaps a joint meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee and the Strategic Planning Committee. And I also want to take this advantage of your time today. If you have additional guidance that you want to make sure that we as staff and university representatives receive as we begin to put these work plans together. Tim mentioned in the Budget Committee earlier that the 2010 university work plans, which include the tuition differential proposals, will be due to the board office by May 27th. And I want to just excuse me, briefly go over what you can expect to see in those work plans. Certainly we'll have a reiteration of the formal mission statement and any formal vision statement that is in place for the institution. But then what we're working on is we want the institutions to respond to a series of guiding questions that will help Board of Governors members better understand the university administration's and the Board of Trustees' perspective on the strengths, the core, unique, niche contributions that the institution can make, as well as their vision going forward for the next 5 to 10 years. This could be more of a challenge than I expected. As the Chancellor mentioned, the university targets on the select dashboard metrics that were included in the annual reports. In other words, what each institution thinks it's going to be able to add to the systemic mix on those indicators. We will be meeting with the Council of Academic Vice Presidents subsequent to this meeting to discuss some basic underlying assumptions that each of the institutions will work from relative to the development of those targets. And then each institution will also be asked to speak to at least 3 institution-specific goals on which the university is going to focus its efforts in the next 3 years or so, and the metrics by which they plan to measure their own progress against those goals. The institutions will be asked to give the Board of Governors a sense of any new degree programs that they expect to take to their boards of trustees in the next 3 years for consideration, so we can get a sense of what the plans are from the institutional perspective of degree development in the coming years, and so we can have more meaningful discussions about strategic planning from a systemic perspective. We also want to make sure that the institutions have an opportunity, the institutional representatives have an opportunity to make you aware of any unique opportunities that have popped up that they're going to be putting attention to in the coming year. And certainly, as we've mentioned before, the tuition differential proposal will be a component of the plan. And the final component of the plan includes the enrollment plan, but we may have to actually bring that in as an addendum because there is some timing difficulties with that. So at the end of this week, board staff will be sending out a set of work papers to our institutional liaisons to begin the staff-to-staff discussions about the identification of institutional targets on the selected dashboard metrics. And each institution will be asked to identify either a numeric or at least a directional target, depending on what the metric is, of where they expect to go. What we'll provide is the data that were provided in the 2009 annual report, and then 5 years forward from whatever that last year of data were to give you a sense of where they're heading or hope to head, given the current constraints that they're working under. And we also would we've been given guidance from a number of you that you'd like to know how well any of these targets or goals actually align with existing institutional strategic plans. Because, of course, one of the things we're constantly working on is trying to gain more alignment among state plans, system plans, institutional plans, and these work plans. Subsequent to staff making any final corrections to the template, we'll get that out for the universities to complete. I've spoken to almost all of you on an individual basis, and I would just like to reiterate, if you have any particular guiding questions that you want to make sure that we present to institutional representatives to respond to, either in the work plan itself in written format or when they do presentations to the board in June, please let us know. I think that this discussion that we just had relative to educational sites presents an example. I've heard a number of you as board members say, I would certainly hope to know about any potential site development that is going on for a particular institution in their work planning discussion. If there are other kinds of information that you feel like would provide you with a good foundation to begin discussions between the Board of Governors and the Boards of Trustees about where they're going in the coming years, please let me know. I think just a few closing comments from a staff perspective, if you will, Mr. Chair. You know, this is going to be the first time that the board receives university work plans. Obviously, the tuition differential component has to be approved by the Board of Governors. However, some portions of the work plan may serve you better actually as merely a place to start the conversations. It's not like we're going to be able to reach final conclusions on everything in the first meeting, but hopefully that the work plans will provide a venue for the discussions to begin to take place. The goal is to provide a venue for the discussions to allow university representatives to really lay out their assessment of their hopes and intentions for each university. You know, what are the special assets that they bring to the system? Where are their niche contribution areas? What do they want to become? Why? How? How do the goals fit into the greater picture for the region and the state and even the nation? And has the institution charted out a reasonable plan for getting to where they want to go? How's the institution marshaling its resources to be able to get there? Again, the discussion this morning about the FAU medical program, I thought some of the kinds of questions that were being asked relative to push and pull, relative to protecting one program and the impact on other programs are all very informative when we think about having discussions about university plans for going forward. With that, I'll pause, Mr. Chair, and if you have any particular questions or guidance for us as we go forward, we'd appreciate it.
What's the timeline that you're going to lay out for developing the work plans? I know there's a date for May the 27th, but what are the other significant dates that we need to be aware of?
I think that most of the in-between dates are going to be the staff-to-staff tactical discussions and things like that. We will send out at the end of this week work papers relative to beginning the discussions about the determination of targets for the selected dashboard metrics pursuant to our last discussion at the last meeting. Tim is going to be working with interim kinds of developmental discussions relative to the tuition differential. The expectation as it currently stands is that the university boards of trustees per regulation are actually the ones who are to submit the work plan, including the tuition differential, to the board. I know that some issues have been raised for your consideration relative to university boards of trustees schedules that may or may not need attention. But the next key date will be the 27th. That will give staff some time to do some analysis, but university representatives should plan to be available at the workshop at the June board meeting to engage in discussions, presentations and discussions, and we'll build out the structure for that moving closer toward the June meeting.
Okay. Any questions? Any board members? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Madam Chair, that ends our report. Committee.